Hi, everybody. Welcome to CMN 201. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 28th, where I wanted to put some closure onto the cabinet of Dr. Caligari and introduce our next film, which happens to be Dracula. Also note that our first journal will be due today if you are watching this video on the 28th, which is Wednesday. Journal number 1 will be due at 11:59 p.m. or earlier, and I ask that you send your journal via PDF to my email, which is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, @gcc.mass.edu. And the journals are meant to be an informal response for each of the films that we'll be viewing, and that means your first journal will be on Dr. Caligari, though certainly you can reference elements of other things that we've discussed prior to this point. And I think of it as a page or so of reflection and question and observation, more than just plot summary. So that said, there isn't any particular format that you need to follow for this. I think of it as a kind of conversation on paper. And as such, I don't grade for grammar or mechanics, just for content. And I evaluate it very informally on a checkmark system. So a plus would be excellent. A check plus would be very good. A check would be satisfactory. That's usually where most of the grades range. Although there is also a less than satisfactory and an unsatisfactory. So as we will do this over the course of the semester, now we basically will have regular writing assignments due every week. So there'll be an exchange of papers so that by the ending of the semester, you should have a journal that basically serves as informal commentary for all of the major films that we've seen. That will perhaps be useful to you for the final examination, which will be an essay exam. It will be open book, open note, which means that you can reference things such as your journals. And also might be important to you as well, or at least useful to you as well, for your final course project, which we'll be talking about over the next several classes. But basically, it's an opportunity for you to examine something much more in depth about media and popular culture in relation to horror film, which is the subject or our topic subject of this particular class. But that's something that won't be due until the ending of the semester, though certainly it's a good idea for you to begin thinking about it now. And for those journals, they can just be bullet points. They don't necessarily have to be complete sentences and paragraphs unless you'd like them to be. As I had indicated, I just wanted to be able to reflect on your observations. Something that has been happening with the discussion forum questions. The difference is that the discussion forum is open for everyone to view, unlike the journal responses, which would just be between me and you. And as I had indicated with the discussion forum responses, you're not required necessarily to respond to your peers, but you are required to read their responses and my responses to them. So basically, that would mimic the kind of class conversation we would be having if we were meeting in person. And then certainly, if you wanted to add additional observations to either your peers or to me, you could do so on the discussion forum, much like you would do in a class by raising your hand. So this is my attempt to try to duplicate or at least replicate some of what we would have done with discussion. So I left you with watching The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which has been identified by film critic Roger Ebert and usually most others that this is the first feature-length horror film. Though we had talked about some horror shorts. It's usually viewed as an art film. It's very cinematic and rather surprising considering its early date from 1920. So you could actually just watch this in terms of visuals, and I think it's stunning considering how it goes about trying to depict the mind of a madman, which is the twist in this story. This silent horror film by German Rice was released after foreign film industries were relaxing some of their restrictions on importing German films because of the war. And there very much is this nightmare quality to this film that has influenced many contemporary filmmakers. If you are familiar with Tim Burton's work, something like Edward Scissorhands, then you'll see some of the parallels with César in this piece. And this piece is usually identified as creating the German expressionistic cinema technique, where you have these disjointed and surreal and dreamlike, bizarre, shadowy images. They oftentimes are symbolic, and they represent madness and insanity and the blending of the two. If you are familiar with the film Nosferatu, a very famous film that actually is something that we will talk about a little bit more in a few moments, then you are familiar with that kind of look to German Expressionism. Very artistically experimental. And I think part of it was because of the anxieties of the 1920s. This would be post World War I, and something that oftentimes is not discussed in history classes, but is so relevant. This would have been the Spanish flu pandemic time period as well. So as we go through our own pandemic, we understand the anxieties associated with that. Madness, trauma, death, murder, disfigurement, mutilation, disease, enforced conformity, economic depression, mass industrialization, repression, and the terrifying aspects of reality are just a few of the elements that would have been on people's minds in the 1920s, and many, I think, are on our minds in today's world, with a central question of who exactly is the enemy. And that perhaps is a question that is oftentimes asked during war. Remember, the First World War was the first industrialized war. This was killing on an industry scale. And yes, you're going to have elements of silent film. So if you've never seen a silent film before, it is going to seem a little bit awkward to you. There will be overacting there. You'll see some of the early filming techniques that might seem a little bit archaic. That said, again, this idea of the narrator Francis and the story frame is quite sophisticated. And as I had indicated to some of you in your discussion forum questions, at least according to history, this was not part of the original film. The story frame was not an element, and it was something that was added in afterwards, because of concerns that producers had that the film would be viewed as a political commentary. Because oftentimes we see the Dr. Caligari figure as representing German government or German authoritarianism, something that's insane and out of control, and that the hypnotized servant Caesar would represent the German populace, basically just blindly, sleepily following German authoritarianism and murdering Caligari's enemies for no good reason. This distrust of authority is something that's embedded within the text. Now, when you add the frame, that complicates things because our narrator is mad or insane. Is it possible that our narrator can be mad and insane and Dr. Caligari is also villainous? The ending is quite ominous when he says, I know how to cure Francis. So the question is, is it something that we need to completely dismiss just because we have our narrator who is in an insane asylum? And could the most sane people be in insane asylums? Which is a question that sometimes is even asked today in a world that condones things like the mass killing of human beings, or at least allows it if it doesn't condone it. Now, what we've got here, this sleepwalker, a term you might not have heard of before, somnambulist. And you can see in the notes below, I've broken it up for you so that you can pronounce it. That's what a sleepwalker is. This idea of sleeping and being awake, and sleeping and the nightmare associated with sleep. Is any of this really happening? I think we all probably had that feeling at the beginning of the pandemic. Is this even real? And again, they had a world war that they had to confront as well as a pandemic. Alan's question, Caesar's friend, to Caesar the sleepwalker, who is also supposed to be able to tell the future. And note that the sleepwalker works as a kind of doppelganger, a terrifying or ghostly double, which is something that you oftentimes see in the Gothic. But Alan's question, how long shall I live? Question you really are not supposed to know, but also is probably the questions of Germany, because of both the pandemic and also because of the world or the war. I'm going to sneeze. I'm sorry. Nope, I'm not going to sneeze. Okay. Because I declared I was going to sneeze, that made the sneeze go away. But at any rate, okay, now that I no longer have a sneeze here, what we've got are Germans asking that question as well. How long shall I live? And of course, our first twist, and we've got multiple twists, is that it turns out that Caligari is supposed to be some sort of 18th century mystic. This works very well with the Gothic and the horror tradition, and that he's some sort of supernatural entity, was able to resurrect someone like Caesar. The second twist that we find out is that Francis is insane, so he's the unreliable narrator, asking us to question who do we trust, and that it's Caligari who really is the head of the insane asylum. Um, this madness, sanity, and film style is appropriate for this dark, twisted, bizarre, distorted imagery that we're given. Notice how disorienting the shapes are. There is this carnival or funhouse like atmosphere with unnaturally high stools, painted shadows on the walls, distorted angles, a distorted mix of all kinds of art forms. Very expressionistic, very distinctive from American films. And I had suggested last class a kind of psychological mindscape, a dreamlike fantasy of what goes on in the mind of an insane individual. And if this is the way that they perceive reality, then perhaps that explains their insane behavior. The philosophical idea, too, that reality is subjective. What is reality? Which is something that we can't determine in this text. That I don't know if you notice the iris shots or the eye shots, where oftentimes the camera would close on an image and then open again on another image as if it was an eye opening and closing, suggesting the individual eye and the subjective nature about how we receive narrative and how we perceive reality, which again I think is a very sophisticated technique for the time period. Also, just the idea of cabinets. There was this idea of the cabinet of curiosities, where you would have basically individuals who would travel out from shows and fairs to show that which was the most obscure and the most titillating of human possibilities. But think about a cabinet as also representational of perhaps the subconscious and what can be released upon opening the cabinet. And Caesar, of course, is what's released here. And if Caesar is a killer, perhaps that's what's in our subconscious that could be released with just the right manipulation. Many people say that this film anticipates World War II and the German populace being controlled by Hitler. Regardless of how you want to see that film, it is important from the horror film perspective because it is considered to be the first horror film, which is why I started with Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. I move forward to Dracula because Dracula is considered to be the first American horror film, and most of our class is embedded in the American tradition. So we saw in Nightmares and Red, White, and Blue. The 1930s is when perhaps we had the height of some of the American horror film movie monsters. Frankenstein, Dracula, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, some of the Universal monsters that we've become quite familiar with. And basically, in the 1930s, they were adapting texts from Europe from the 1800s. These were Gothic texts, and basically they established some of the conventions that we've become accustomed to in horror films, such as setting, for instance, or the use of persecuted female. And the events of the 1930s in America very much, I think, influenced the style of those films, much like I suggested the events in Germany in the 1920s and world events as well helped to influence the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. So the 1930s puts us in the Great Depression. So there was this great need for escapism and entertainment. And also, you notice that Dracula and the films of this time period end with the vanquishing of evil, evil presented as other or foreigner, which we will definitely see in Dracula. So again, that idea of trying to pacify the masses by assuring them that ultimately um, good prevails over evil, or their perception of good prevails over their perception of evil. Outsider is vanquished. So, for anybody who's concerned about things like invading outsider, or the loss of American identity, or the loss of American economic power, that's something that could be assuaged through these films as well. Think about also what was going on in Europe with fascism, what was going on in the East with communism, the anti Semitic movement, the movement for eugenics, about selective breeding to bring out positive qualities, and all of the racism and prejudice embedded in that. It was also the time of the women's vote when you think about the 1920s, and film, as we know, is more than just escapism. It's social commentary. So fear of female. And notice how often Dracula's victims are female. Um, it was first adapted to screen in 1921 with the film that I referenced earlier, Nosferatu, which is not only a great example of German expressionism, and you'll see in the notes below in the second section, I've got a link of Nosferatu so you can see one of those very famous images of Nosferatu with the shadow on the wall, with the elongated fingers. Again, those angles and so forth that are very reminiscent of what we saw with Dr. Caligari. The story of Nosferatu is quite interesting because, again, it was a unauthorized version of the novel Dracula, upon which the film is loosely based, both Nosferatu and also the film Dracula. And or Bram Stoker's widow, Bram Stoker being the author of Dracula, did everything in her power to try to have Nosferatu destroyed, but fortunately for us, a copy survived so that we could see that German expressionistic technique. And some of the elements of Nosferatu will be elements that we will see in other horror films as the semester progresses. This use of shadow, atmosphere, and so forth. Director Todd Browning, who directed Dracula, is probably best well known for a film he directed called Freaks that came out in 1932. It was done pre-code and it was banned. And again, if you can see in the notes below in the second section, I've got a link so that you can see an image from Freaks. The reason why it was banned is because the film was about circus freaks, and Browning used real, quote, freaks, unquote, individuals who had various forms of disfigurement and disabilities, and that was just too much for the audience. It is very much a tale about how abnormality and normality is viewed in society. I don't want to give away too many spoilers in the event that you want to see the film. For a long time, it was very difficult to find this film. But with the internet, it's not too difficult to find most things anymore. It was difficult because it was banned. And again, if you think about Todd Browning's perspective, he oftentimes has been called the father of American horror film. He believed that most people are morbid, so that perhaps explains the approach he took to Freaks, and also the approach he took to Dracula, which came out in 1931 and not only is credited as being the first American horror film, but the Library of Congress, the U.S. National Film Registry, has included Dracula as being, quote, culturally, historically, aesthetically significant. Which is going to be our attendance question, is after you've seen the film, you may have seen the film Dracula, but I've noticed that as my teaching career has progressed, that students have seen less and less of these classics. Originally, Dracula had no musical score. It gives a very different feeling to the film when you watch the film without a musical score. I unfortunately was unable to find a free copy that did not have the silent element to it. Certainly, you can find it easily enough if you're willing to pay for it. If you wanted to go on Netflix, or you could search for it, or if you wanted to go on to Amazon, and there are a number of other sources as well. Keep in mind that I've got hard copies of these. Of all of these films on reserve in the GCC library, so that's another way that you can view the film. But I was able to find a free link so that if it turns out that you wanted to watch a free link of Dracula, but it does include a soundtrack. And this is important because the soundtrack ultimately gives so much additional layers of meaning. So that said, I think Dracula works quite nicely without the soundtrack. There's this sense of eerie stillness and quietness to it. If you've ever seen the movie A Quiet Place, then you know how frightening silence can be. Sometimes silence is more frightening than sound. But at any rate, I did want to draw your attention to that and also talk a little bit about how Dracula, the film, was based on that Bram Stoker novel. And Bram Stoker was brilliant in some respects by naming Dracula after a cruel Romanian emperor, Dracul, the son of the devil. And you might have heard of Vlad the Impaler, was Dracula. And I have in the notes below in the second section under the novel Dracula, or maybe that should be the third section. Yeah, I guess that should be the third section. I'm sorry. About the novel Dracula. I've got some links with some images of Vlad the Impaler, who's known for being a very cruel 1400s Romanian conqueror, and that he did indeed impale his victims. And there's a famous woodcut, and I've included that image for you to see, of him having supper surrounded by his impaled victims. Of course, the idea of impaling is going to be important when we get to the film and also the text, Dracula itself. If you've ever read the novel Dracula, you'll know that it is much different than the 1930s Hollywood version. No surprise there, because text is usually very different from film. I almost think of it as two separate stories. There's the 1930s film, which has become so iconic that even if somebody hasn't seen the film, they're quite aware in a vague way of the story, and certainly of the Bela Lugosi image of Dracula that is forever cemented in our minds. A couple of interesting things about Bela Lugosi is that he played a Dracula for the Broadway stage play. The Broadway stage play was adapted to the film. And many of the conventions associated with the film, such as the collar, for instance, that stands up, that was a Broadway stage convention. So they needed to try to figure out how to do special effects in real time and live time. And of course, having a vampire disappear into thin air would not be an easy trick to do. And having a trapdoor on the stage with a costume that would be fixed so that it would remain standing with the collar up as the actor moved down into the stage trapdoor, not only was a clever theatrical convention, but it also became an iconic convention because, again, when we think of the Dracula figure, we think of the cape and we think of the collar, and the Lugosi portrayal with the very famous accent. And do note that Lugosi was not very adept at speaking English when he took the role. So he learned the role phonetically, which is one of the reasons why we have this stilted speech that, again, we've become accustomed to with Dracula, that I want to suck your blood. So in terms of Dracula, I wanted to talk more about Dracula next class, talk about some of the sexual imagery associated with the film, to talk a little bit also about some of the commentary about other and the vanquishing of that which is different. So you can keep those elements in mind when you are watching the film. But after you see the film, my question to you is for our attendance question, and this will be due on the 30th of September, Friday, by 6 p.m. But if you need additional time, please let me know. After watching the film Dracula, do you agree or disagree that the 1930s Dracula is, quote, culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant? At least according to what the film registry says. And why? So I'm curious to know what your reactions are to the film. For those of you who have perhaps seen the film before, now you can view it with a new perspective. You can view it much more carefully, more than just for entertainment or escapism. For those of you who've never seen the film before, well then, you're probably watching first and foremost for plot. But keep in mind that watching film critically and analytically would be the same as reading literature critically and analytically. That you probably need multiple reviewings of a film, much like you need multiple rereadings of a piece of literature in order to get all of the nuance. But I will, of course, point out some of that to you next class. Just didn't want to give too many spoilers away. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and enjoy Dracula. Take care. Bye-bye.